protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the maximum number of people who entered the Capitol was 2,000. And now you're calling it tens of thousands of people because you know so well. In fact, you conceded in the very first question I asked you that of course there has to be a quantitative component in terms of the gravity of the threat in order to seriously call it an insurrection or a coup, which is why...
Well, one of my favorites, Glenn Greenwald. I do have great respect for Glenn Greenwald. And he is appearing on Destiny's channel. He's debating Destiny. Some guy in the middle there moderating. But what are they talking about? Well, whatever. What else? You know, liberal idiot Destiny. If you know him, he apparently makes a living by screaming at more intelligent people online and then calling it a debate. That's all I ever see. Today, Glenn Greenwald schools him hard. And in this clip, they're going to talk about the so-called January 6th insurrection. From what I've seen of Destiny in previous clips, his main debating technique consists primarily of talking fast and being absurdly obnoxious. You just want to. You just want to, you know what I mean. As usual, Glenn Greenwald keeps a cool head here and dispassionately dissects Destiny's ludicrous attempt at arguing that January 6th was a coup or an insurrection. So let's take a look here and see if there's any sense at all. If Glenn Greenwald can get through to Destiny, that's a very hard ask.
Protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the
Sorry, there I started at the wrong place. Very unprofessional. And here we go. Let's see.
To not be successful. When we talk about how...
If it's a joke, then if it's a joke, it should be treated as such.
If it was a joke...
World historic event.
It was a historic event.
That threatened the United States government.
It did threaten the U.S. government. It was a historic event. What other time in U.S. history has the certification of the vote been delayed?
The certification, we've had so many official proceedings of Congress, including things like confirming Supreme Court justices, delayed because people went to Capitol Hill, entered Capitol Hill, occupied Capitol Hill, and protested the proceedings and ended up delaying the proceedings. There have been proceedings to vote on wars, where anti-war protesters have disrupted. So all the time we've had people entering the Capitol, protesting congressional proceedings, and never are the ones who don't use violence accused of felonies, let alone anything resembling the kinds of charges that the January 6th defendants faced, because the ideological component here is what made this to be something so much bigger than in fact what it was.
I'm going to ask the same question again. When in the history of the United States has the certification of the electoral vote, the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, been delayed by protesters or violent protesters?
I'm happy to concede that this is the first time that people went on January 6th.
Then it's historical. Then it's historical.
And interrupted the proceeding.
Yeah, then it's historical, right? By definition, it's a moment in history that is unique.
It wasn't a serious disruption.
They delayed the vote, didn't they?
By 3 hours or by 4 hours.
For the first time in U.S. history, yes. That's significant. That's serious.
Why is it more significant to delay this proceeding than other congressional proceedings? Things like voting on wars or confirming Supreme Court justices are pretty serious, too, in terms of the things Congress is supposed to do under Article 1. But the reason we don't consider those protests, even though they might have delayed the proceedings some, to be historic or serious or an insurrection, is because they never posed a threat to the stability of the United States government. In order to have an actual insurrection of the kind that you want to claim this is, you would need enormous numbers of very well-trained people who are heavily armed with serious plans to go into the Capitol and overthrow the power of the United States government. This is the kind of drama queen behavior that has dominated the Trump years, where every kind of event is catastrophized to its highest extent.
So you would say that any past, so like the Whiskey Rebellion in the United States, That's stupid. They shouldn't have called it that. They should have called it like the farmer protest or something different. Or because what you're saying right now, it stands in contrast to how every other person viewed insurrectionism or insurrectionists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was drafted and ratified. People viewed people sometimes as being insurrectionary or giving aid or comfort to enemies of the United States just for letting their children go off to war to serve the Confederacy. It's nice if you, Glenn Greenwald, personally have some view of what you personally think an insurrectionist or rebellion might look like or what it should be, but to be quite frank, your opinion doesn't really matter. The opinion would be the historical relevance of the saying in the United States. It would be the historical analysis that exists for historical rebellions or insurrections in the United States, which oftentimes had very little to no chance of succeeding. Even the insurrectionists themselves thought that they weren't going to succeed. And we would use that analysis that exists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was ratified, and then we would use that going forward to figure out what do we think an insurrection and a rebellion is. And again, you can try to minimize and you can try to call it ideological and whatever you want. None of those congressional protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the maximum number of people who entered the Capitol was 2,000.
Yeah, you see what I mean about Destiny. The guy, he's just got verbal diarrhea. He just spews and spews and spews. And he gets caught up in these little sort of details like, well, you know, basically Glenn Greenwald is saying it wasn't an insurrection, it wasn't a coup. I said the same thing to my entire family, like 2 days after it happened. They were calling it a coup. I said, it wasn't a coup. What are you talking about? Pretty much for the same reasons Glenn Greenwald says, because there wasn't that many people. They weren't armed, for one thing. They'd been protesting, got out of hand, turned into a riot. And yes, they broke into a building and then were let in to the building. And once inside, they just kind of wandered around. They didn't threaten. They didn't hold weapons, didn't hold guns up to congresspersons, members of Congress heads or anything like that. They didn't go after them. They didn't hang people in the streets. They didn't commit any violence, as we all know, against anybody. So the whole thing is just ridiculous. And Destiny is just getting sidetracked on little details here. Just refuses to see that. In fact, I've never seen Destiny concede a point at all, which is why I hardly ever watch his debates.
And now you're calling it tens of thousands of people because you know so well. In fact, you conceded in the very first question I asked you that of course there has to be a quantitative component in terms of the gravity of the threat in order to seriously call it an insurrection or a coup, which is why I began by asking you whether or not if two people armed with knives went to the Congress and demanded that Donald Trump be removed after he was declared the winner and threatened to use violence with their knives, whether that would in the history books or by our major newspapers be referred to as the United States fighting off a coup or an insurrection. And you said, yeah, I guess if it's just two people, then it would probably be pretty ridiculous to call it that. So I see this, what happened on January 6th, a 3-hour riot that even the FBI's informants on the ground told the FBI in real time was never intended to be any kind of premeditated violent act on the part of most people, but instead was something that happened spontaneously, as so often happens where political protests confront the police and become violent. I see it much more akin to the kind of ridiculous example that I began by asking you, where you conceded that wouldn't be called an insurrection, than I do some kind of Civil War type situation or even a meaningful armed rebellion of the kind that happened in Russia last year, where even that was crushed in 12 hours.
Are you familiar with Loki's wager?
Explain it to me.
So I think Loki makes a wager with two dwarves or whatever, and eventually they say that they can cut his head off. It comes to the point to where he loses the wager. They go to collect their bet, and when they're trying to figure out how to cut his head off, they're arguing over what part of the neck is when the head starts and then the rest of the neck begins, basically. And the argument he eventually makes is, well, you can't take even a centimeter, an inch of my neck, therefore you're not allowed to cut my head off. You're trying to argue right now that because I might not consider two people an insurrection, that I can't possibly consider 2,000 people an insurrection? That's the same as you saying, since I can't tell precisely where your head ends and your neck begins, I might say that your toe is part of your head. Jesus.
Oh, you see what I mean about Destiny? That's why I only watch little bits and pieces of his stuff from time to time, and I'm only watching this because of Glenn Greenwald. Yeah, the quantitative component, i.e. the number of people involved, is one criterion, as Glenn Greenwald said, obviously. 2,000 people could well be an insurrection. But there are also other criteria, destiny, such as being armed, such as announcing, attacking the actual people in power and, arresting them or killing them, taking control of the Capitol, that would be one thing, or the White House, going on TV and radio and announcing that you're in control. All those things, yes, that kind of thing starts happening. Then we're talking about a coup or an insurrection, okay? Just check out any banana republic in Latin America. This kind of thing happens all the time, or in Africa too. Some general and his soldiers, the army decides that they don't like the way things are going, so they take over. And then they announce that they're the new bosses. And it works or it doesn't work, whatever. But that's an insurrection. That is a coup. Not a bunch of angry protesters.
This argument is nonsense, and the only way that you can make the argument is to continue to try to make comparisons to other more extreme coups or more intense insurrectionist attempts, which I agree. There can be more extreme insurrectionist attempts. There can be more extreme coups. But the reality is, even if you want to wind it all the way back down, and say, like, okay, we'll ignore the tens of thousands of protesters outside. We can just go with 2,000 people. Glenn, how are you seriously going to argue that 2,000 people inside the Capitol with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote, which they accomplished, doesn't represent an insurrection?
They delayed the certification of the vote. Yeah, that's not an insurrection. They caused a delay, okay. They didn't like the way the vote had gone. But a true insurrection would be destroying the apparatus of power or taking over the apparatus of power.
Wait a second, Glenn, just before you go on, I just want to put you on Glenn's question. So Glenn's question was, he said, an insurrection when there's an actual threat to democracy. I'm pushing off that a vote isn't a threat to democracy. At what point did you call it an insurrection? Would you call it an insurrection on January 6th?
I don't know, here's the thing. I don't know the thin line that they'd have to cross to call it an insurrection, but whatever line that is, it was crossed a long time ago. You had the President of the United States calling up over 100,000 people to D.C., and then he riled them up, saying that they needed to essentially delay the vote. He was relying on Pence to do it. All of those protesters went to the White House. A lot of them, or not to the White House, sorry, to the Capitol building. A lot of them broke into the Capitol building with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote because they didn't like the outcome of the election and they wanted to change it. They needed to fight like hell to take their country back because Mike Pence wasn't going to do the right thing by helping Trump do his constitutional coup. And so they turned it into an insurrection. It's plenty of what happened. Now, if only 20 people went in, would I consider it an insurrection? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If only, 100 people went in, maybe. Maybe if 200 people went in and they got further, maybe. I'm not sure where exactly I would, slice the pie to call it, whatever we call it. But wherever we're at, we're way, 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 way over that. And I just don't think the comparisons to other more extreme coups or more extreme rebellions or anything in Russia, it just doesn't make any sense. It's only done to equivocate on what's actually happened or to do a whataboutism to something that I would probably plainly agree with. Like, wouldn't you agree this is a more serious coup or more serious insurrection? Yeah, sure, there can be more serious coups and more serious insurrections. Much the same, there could be more brutal murders of one person and another. It doesn't make one murder not a murder just because you did it easier or did it cleaner.
Okay, so first of all, the reason, as I said at the start, why historical comparisons or historic comparisons to other incidents are so important is because there's a gigantic ideological and partisan motive here in exaggerating the extent to which what happened on January 6th was a serious threat. And especially when somebody is a Democratic Party partisan who goes around saying the Democratic Party is better, we want people to go and vote for Democrats, we want to make sure Donald Trump doesn't return to power. And at the same time, the narrative they're pushing coincidentally aligns perfectly with their partisan agenda, then I think it's important to start questioning whether or not there's any authenticity to the beliefs based on how other situations have previously been treated. So let me just make 2 points here about what Donald Trump did. You're actually allowed to summon people to Washington to protest. It's one of the most important rights that the Constitution guarantees. The president is completely free to call his supporters to Washington and to tell them and argue for them that some injustice has been committed and that they ought to protest in response to it. There was one time, and only one time, when Donald Trump addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used when those people went to the Capitol. And what he said was this, quote, "I know that everybody here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." And the fact that people, because he said peacefully, then have to resort to things like, oh, well, he invoked political cliches like fight like hell. Politicians use fight like hell in almost every speech.
Well, Glenn Greenwald just blew him out of the water right there, obviously. So he makes a great point about how the president is perfectly entitled to call his visitors to Washington to protest. And he quoted what Trump said. He certainly did not call for violence. A protest got out of hand, turned into a riot, and some damage was done to the Capitol building, very minor. And that was it, basically. And a bunch of people have been arrested and thrown in prison for a long time compare that to some of the ludicrously short prison sentences that murderers and rapists and serious criminals get. The whole thing's outrageous, and I hope Donald Trump pardons them, because I would love, I'd love to see him go free, obviously, because they don't deserve to be there. And secondly, I would love to see all the liberals' heads explode. It's going to be glorious when it happens, so I hope he does do it. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments. I have been reading all the comments recently and have been replying to quite a few. It really helps the channel when you comment, helps the algorithm find me. And also like and subscribe. Don't forget to do that, because it helps me continue growing the channel and continue making content for you.